Winter mercilessly devours unprepared souls. Frost bites deep into bones, shattering arrogance and pride alike. Mockery echoes loudly during warm summer months, yet silence reigns when blizzards roar. Everyone laughed at Samuel Hayes. Neighbors pointed fingers, calling his elevated cabin a foolish mistake. Building a home suspended 4 feet above solid earth seemed absurd in snow country. People whispered about freezing drafts and wasted money. Fools trust conventional wisdom blindly. Samuel knew better. He understood thermodynamic survival and ancient Roman engineering. Soon, freezing temperatures would arrive, turning mocking laughter into desperate pleas for warmth and salvation. The town of Pine Haven, nestled deep within the rugged valleys of the Pacific Northwest, was a place where tradition dictated survival. Generations of loggers, miners, and off-grid enthusiasts had built their homes the exact same way, low to the ground, anchored to thick concrete slabs with heavy roofs, designed to shrug off the inevitable winter snows. When a man built a house in Pine Haven, he built a bunker. You dug deep, you poured thick, and you hunkered down. Then came Samuel Hayes. Samuel was a quiet, unassuming man in his late 50s. He had arrived in Pine Haven in early spring, purchasing a 5-acre plot of undeveloped land right on the edge of the Whispering Pines subdivision. His background was a mystery to most. Some claimed he was a retired civil engineer from Chicago. Others swore he was an eccentric academic who had lost his tenure. Whatever his past, his present actions quickly made him the primary source of entertainment for the locals. The spectacle began in May. Instead of excavating a traditional basement or pouring a massive concrete slab to absorb geothermal heat, Samuel hired a crew to drill 16 deep, narrow holes into the bedrock. Into these holes, he set heavy-duty steel I-beams, anchoring them with specialized expanding concrete. When the crew left, what remained looked less like the foundation of a home and more like the skeletal legs of a massive steel insect. The base of his future cabin was suspended exactly 4 feet above the damp, loamy earth. Richard Brooks, a local contractor whose house sat a mere quarter-mile down the road, was the first to vocalize the town's collective confusion. Richard was a loud, imposing man who took pride in his sprawling, heavily insulated ranch-style home. "You building a tree house." "Hayes," Richard called out one afternoon, leaning against his pickup truck as Samuel meticulously leveled the massive wooden joists across the steel beams. "Or are you expecting the valley to turn into a lake?" Samuel paused, adjusting his worn leather work gloves. He offered a polite, mild smile. "Just preparing for winter, Richard." Richard let out a booming laugh that echoed through the trees. "Preparing for winter by lifting your floorboards into the wind. You're going to freeze to death, man. The wind will whip right under that floor. It'll be like sleeping on a block of ice. You need ground contact to keep the pipes from bursting." "I have a different approach," Samuel replied calmly, turning back to his measurements. But Samuel's approach only grew stranger. As the weeks passed, he didn't just build a standard floor over his elevated joists. He began constructing an intricate, multi-layered underbelly. He hauled in hundreds of thick, hollow clay tiles, stacking them in a maze-like pattern between the floor joists. Over these, he laid sheets of heavy corrugated steel, then a thick layer of dense river stones he'd spent weeks collecting from the nearby creek. Only then did he install the hardwood floorboards. To the untrained eye, it was an immense waste of money and labor. He was creating a massive, heavy subfloor that seemingly served no purpose other than adding unnecessary weight to the stilt foundation. Evelyn Carmichael, a retired schoolteacher who functioned as Pine Haven's unofficial town crier, took it upon herself to monitor Samuel's progress. From her porch, armed with a pair of brass binoculars, she scrutinized every delivery truck that arrived at his property. "It's a tragedy, really," Evelyn told a group of neighbors over Sunday coffee at the local diner. "The man is clearly losing his faculties. He's building a swamp shack in the mountains. I saw him installing what looked like a chimney, but instead of going up through the roof, it goes down into the dirt. He's going to burn his own house down, or freeze to death trying." The structure Evelyn had seen was indeed peculiar. Samuel had constructed a heavily reinforced fireproof brick furnace roughly 10 feet away from the actual cabin. A large insulated ceramic pipe ran from the back of this outdoor furnace directly into the 4-foot gap beneath the cabin, connecting to the maze of hollow clay tiles he had hidden under the floorboards. By late July, the cabin's exterior was finished. It was a beautiful structure wrapped in rich dark cedar siding with a steep-pitched metal roof. Yet the aesthetic was entirely ruined in the eyes of the locals by the yawning 4-foot void beneath it. It looked temporary, fragile, and utterly out of place among the grounded heavy homes of his neighbors. The mockery shifted from quiet whispers to open jokes. At the local hardware store, clerks would ask Samuel if he needed to buy parachutes for his living room furniture. Teenagers jokingly referred to his property as the UFO landing pad. Through it all, Samuel remained painfully polite and entirely unflappable. He never argued, never defended his design, and never engaged in the petty squabbles. He simply continued his work, meticulously sealing every joint, caulking every window, and spending his evenings splitting an absolute mountain of dense hardwood, which he stacked with geometric precision in the strange open void beneath his home. As August gave way to September, the golden hues of autumn began to paint the Pine Haven Valley. With the changing leaves came the annual anxiety of winter preparation. Residents began scheduling propane deliveries, tuning up snowblowers, and inspecting their roof trusses. For Samuel Hayes, autumn brought a different kind of storm bureaucratic warfare. Evelyn Carmichael's incessant gossip had eventually reached the ears of Gregory Dunn, the county building inspector. Gregory was a man who loved the authority of his clipboard more than the structural integrity of the buildings he inspected. Prompted by concerned citizens who feared Samuel's bizarre structure would become a deadly eyesore when it inevitably collapsed under the winter snow, Gregory arrived at the property unannounced on a crisp Tuesday morning. "Mr. Hayes," Gregory barked, stepping out of his county-issued SUV and immediately pointing a pen at the elevated cabin. "We have a serious problem here. This structure violates multiple county codes regarding foundation grading, subfloor insulation, and residential heating regulations. I am issuing a stop work order and an immediate citation." Samuel, who was systematically bolting thick insulated hinged panels to the outer rim of his stilt foundation, slowly climbed down from his ladder. "Good morning, Inspector Dunn. I assure you every aspect of this build is up to code." "Don't play games with me," Gregory sneered, waving his clipboard. "You have an uninsulated void beneath a primary residence. You have a combustion unit located outside the primary dwelling perimeter, feeding exhaust gases into the foundation. It's a carbon monoxide death trap and a thermal nightmare. You have to tear it down and pour a slab, or I'm condemning it before the first snow." A small crowd had gathered at the edge of Richard Brooks's property across the street, watching the confrontation with thinly veiled satisfaction. Finally, the crazy man with the floating house was getting his comeuppance. Samuel calmly walked to his truck, retrieved a thick, worn leather binder, and flipped to a dog-eared page. "Actually, Inspector, if you refer to County Zoning Ordinance 44-B subsection 12, amended in 1982, you'll see an exemption for high-clearance agricultural dry stores and hypo-cost heating systems, provided the combustion unit is externally drafted and the thermal mass is sealed." Gregory blinked, adjusting his glasses. "A what system?" "IPMA." "A hypocaust," Samuel explained patiently. "It's ancient Roman engineering. The outdoor furnace doesn't pump exhaust into the house. It burns wood at extremely high temperatures. The hot air and smoke are drawn through the sealed clay pipes embedded in the river stones under my floor. The stones absorb the massive heat, radiating it slowly upward into the living space. The smoke then exits safely through a secondary exhaust pipe on the far side of the property. There is no carbon monoxide risk because the system is completely sealed from the living area." Gregory snatched the binder, reading the highlighted text furiously. The law was archaic, a holdover from the days when local farmers built large tobacco and grain drying sheds. But it was still on the books. Legally, Samuel's design was completely permissible. And the 4-foot gap, Gregory demanded, grasping at straws. You're going to lose all your heat to the wind. The panels I'm installing now, Samuel gestured to the thick-hinged skirting around the stilts, will be closed before the snow hits. They trap a massive pocket of dead air beneath the house. Dead air inspector is one of the greatest insulators on Earth. Coupled with the thermal mass of the floor, the cabin will remain at a constant 70 degrees, regardless of the outside temperature. Defeated by a loophole and ancient Roman physics he barely understood, Gregory stormed off, muttering threats about future inspections. The neighborhood, realizing Samuel wasn't going to be shut down, doubled down on their mockery. If the county couldn't stop him, nature would certainly punish him. In late October, the local news station featured Harrison Reed, a charismatic meteorologist known for his dramatic forecasts. Harrison enthusiastically predicted an El Niño pattern, promising the region one of the mildest winters in a decade. "Keep those light jackets out, folks," he beamed through the television screens. "We're looking at low precipitation and above-average temperatures well into January." The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. Evelyn hosted an autumn harvest barbecue, pointedly leaving Samuel off the guest list. As the neighbors sipped spiked apple cider around a massive fire pit, the conversation naturally drifted to the birdhouse down the road. "He spent all that money on a Roman heating system for a winter that isn't even going to happen." Richard Brooks chuckled, flipping a burger. "Even if we did get a freeze, those little wooden skirts he put around the bottom won't stop a sub-zero wind chill. He'll be crying for a space heater by Thanksgiving." But Samuel wasn't watching the local news. He was observing the woolly bear caterpillars, noting their unusually thick, entirely black bands. He was examining the exceptionally thick skins on the local wild onions and watching the frantic, almost desperate hoarding behavior of the squirrels. Nature was lying to the meteorologists, and Samuel knew it. The mild autumn wasn't a reprieve. It was the deep, deceptive breath before a devastating blow. While his neighbors relaxed, trusting the man on the screen, Samuel quietly stacked his final cord of wood, sealed his undercabin skirting, and waited for the sky to fall. November began with a terrifying suddenness. The mild golden autumn didn't just fade, it was violently assassinated. On a Tuesday afternoon, the temperature in Pine Haven was a comfortable 55 degrees. By midnight, an unpredicted freak atmospheric river collided with an Arctic high-pressure system directly over the valley. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a matter of hours, accompanied by a vicious, howling ice storm that coated the entire town in an inch of solid, diamond-hard ice. The suddenness of the freeze was catastrophic for traditional homes. The ground, which had been warm and saturated from autumn rains, flash froze. The rapid expansion of the freezing groundwater acted like a hydraulic press against the traditional concrete slab foundations of the valley. At 3 a.m., Richard Brooks was jolted awake by a sound like a shotgun blast echoing from his basement. He rushed downstairs to find that the sudden ground heave had cracked his foundational slab perfectly down the middle. Cold air was already seeping through the jagged fissure, turning his expensive finished basement into a meat locker. Worse, because his home relied on forced air heating through ducts embedded in the concrete, the structural shift had severed the main trunk line. His furnace was now pumping hot air directly into the frozen earth. Across the street, Evelyn Carmichael was wrapped in 3 heavy quilts, staring in horror at her thermostat. Her low-slung house, built tightly against the ground to prevent drafts, was acting as a giant thermal bridge. The freezing earth was literally sucking the heat out of her home through the floorboards. Despite her furnace running non-stop, the indoor temperature was hovering at a dangerous 48 degrees. Meanwhile, 4 feet off the ground, Samuel Hayes was comfortably sitting in his armchair, wearing a light cotton t-shirt, reading a book on Byzantine history. When the ice storm had begun, Samuel simply walked out to his external furnace, loaded it with the dense hardwood he had perfectly seasoned, and struck a match. The fire roared to life, safely contained within the firebrick. The intense heat along with the smoke was drafted downward, pulled by the clever chimney vacuum into the clay pipes running beneath his floor. Within an hour, the thousands of pounds of river stones beneath his floorboards had absorbed the thermal energy. The floor itself became a massive, gently radiating heat source. Heat naturally rises. It enveloped his entire cabin in a perfectly even, luxurious warmth. Because his home was elevated, the flash-freezing ground beneath him expanded and heaved harmlessly in the empty void. His steel pillars, anchored deep beneath the frost line, didn't budge a single millimeter. The wooden skirting around the base of the cabin performed exactly as Samuel had designed. It blocked the howling wind trapping the air pocket beneath the house. Because the earth under the cabin was shielded from the ice and snow and slightly warmed by the radiant heat escaping downward from the stones, the ambient temperature in the void remained just above freezing. His plumbing pipes, safely bundled in this insulated air pocket, flowed freely. When morning broke, the neighborhood looked like a crystal wasteland. Tree branches heavy with ice snapped and crashed onto power lines. By 8 a.m., the entire valley was plunged into darkness as the grid failed. Panic set in quickly. Without electricity, the forced air furnaces in the sprawling ranch homes were dead useless. The residents of Pine Haven, who had mocked Samuel's primitive off-grid design, were now trapped in rapidly cooling ice boxes. Richard Brooks, wrapped in a heavy parka, trudged furiously across the ice-slicked road toward Samuel's property. He intended to demand that Samuel let them use whatever generator he assumed the man was hiding. But as Richard approached the elevated cabin, he stopped in his tracks, staring in utter disbelief. There was no deafening roar of a generator. The cabin sat silently on its stilts. However, unlike every other house in the neighborhood, which had icicles hanging from the eaves and frosted, opaque windows, Samuel's cabin looked miraculously alive. The snow and ice that had bombarded the roof was already melting, sliding off the steep metal pitch in heavy sheets. The windows were completely clear, devoid of frost. Most shockingly, Richard could see Samuel through the living room window, casually sipping coffee from a mug, steam rising gently in the warm air, still wearing nothing but a short-sleeved shirt. Richard approached the external furnace, feeling the immense radiant heat baking off the brickwork. He looked at the heavy skirting around the base of the cabin. He pressed his gloved hand against it, expecting it to be freezing. It was warm. The entire structure was functioning exactly like a giant, perfectly insulated thermos. Before Richard could raise his fist to knock on the door and swallow his immense pride, the emergency siren from the town center began to wail, a haunting analog sound, powered by a municipal battery backup. Richard's battery-operated weather radio, clipped to his belt, crackled to life, overriding the static with the terrifying voice of the emergency broadcast system. Attention, all residents of Pine Haven County. The National Weather Service has issued a catastrophic blizzard warning. The current ice storm is the precursor to a historic low-pressure system. Expect wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour and snowfall accumulations exceeding 8 feet over the next 48 hours. Power restoration is not expected for several weeks. Do not attempt to travel. Sheltering in place is mandatory. May God be with you. The broadcast cut to static. Richard stared at the radio, the blood draining from his face. 8 feet of snow. Sustained sub-zero temperatures. No power. His house was already cracked and freezing. He looked up at Samuel's elevated cabin, the birdhouse he had mocked so mercilessly, realizing with a sickening jolt that it was the only structure in the valley engineered to survive what was coming. The mockery was officially over. The fight for survival had just begun. By noon on the second day, the sky over Pine Haven had vanished. It was replaced by a churning, violent ocean of white. The blizzard did not merely fall, it attacked. Wind gusts exceeding 70 miles per hour drove the snow horizontally, turning the frozen crystals into abrasive shrapnel that scoured the paint off cars and shattered any window not boarded or heavily shuttered. The temperature outside plummeted to a lethal 22 degrees below zero, with a wind chill that made exposed skin freeze solid in less than 3 minutes. Inside the sprawling modern homes of Whispering Pines, the illusion of civilization was rapidly crumbling. Richard Brooks sat at his expensive granite kitchen island, wrapped in 2 sleeping bags, watching his breath form thick, icy plumes in the air. The temperature inside his home had dropped to 28 degrees and was still falling. Without electricity, his smart home thermostat was a dead black rectangle. The deep fissure in his concrete foundation caused by the initial ground heave was now actively funneling sub-zero wind directly into the crawl space and up through the floorboards. The silence of the dead house was punctuated only by the terrifying sounds of infrastructural death. At 1 p.m., Richard heard a sharp metallic crack from the guest bathroom, followed by the hiss of expanding ice. The water sitting in the P-traps had frozen, shattering the porcelain toilets. Deep within the drywall, copper pipes, unheated and full of stationary water, were bursting like firecrackers, though the water inside them instantly froze rather than flooded. He was a contractor. He knew exactly what was happening. The house was dying. Without thermal intervention, the drywall would soon crack, the joint compound would turn to powder, and the moisture trapped in the insulation would freeze, rendering it useless permanently. But Richard couldn't worry about his property value anymore. He was beginning to worry about his fingers. They were numb, a dull, aching white. A frantic pounding echoed over the howling wind. Richard stumbled to his front door, his joints stiff from the biting cold. He yanked it open instantly, fighting against a violent gust that dumped 3 pounds of snow into his foyer. Standing on the porch was Evelyn Carmichael. She looked nothing like the proud, gossiping woman from the diner. She was swathed in a mismatched assortment of coat scarves and a wool blanket, her face pale and her lips tinged with a terrifying shade of blue. "Richard, oh!" She screamed over the gale, forcing her way inside before he could invite her. "My house? It's a tomb. The wind is coming right through the walls. I can't feel my feet. The fireplace draft is frozen shut. I tried to light a fire and the smoke just filled the living room." Richard slammed the door shut, leaning his full weight against it to engage the deadbolt. "It's no better here, Evelyn. The foundation is cracked. We're losing heat by the minute." "What do we do?" Panic edged her voice, shrill and desperate. "The radio said the plows can't even see the roads. Nobody's coming." Richard looked out the frosted living room window. Through the blinding sheets of white, roughly 400 yards down the lane, a singular beacon of defiance stood against the storm. Samuel Hayes' elevated cabin was a dark silhouette against the whiteout, but from its stainless steel exhaust pipe, a steady, triumphant plume of gray smoke was whipping into the wind. "We swallow our pride," Richard said, his voice grim, "or we freeze to death in the dark." The journey across those 400 yards was the most agonizing physical exertion of their lives. The snow was already waist-deep in the drifts. Every step required lifting their legs high, plunging them into the powder, and dragging their bodies forward against a headwind that felt like a solid wall of ice. Evelyn fell twice, her exhausted muscles giving out. Richard had to haul her up by the collar of her coat, screaming at her to keep moving. The cold penetrated their heavy winter gear, effortlessly biting into their chests and stealing the breath from their lungs. When they finally reached the perimeter of Samuel's property, they encountered the stilt foundation. Up close, the genius of the design was undeniable. The thick wooden skirting that Samuel had bolted around the massive void beneath the house was entirely free of snow buildup. The wind whipping around the aerodynamic elevated structure was actually blowing the snow clear from the base. Richard dragged Evelyn up the heavy wooden stairs to the covered porch. He didn't bother knocking. He simply hammered his heavy insulated boot against the solid oak door. 10 seconds later, the door swung inward. The blast of air that hit Richard and Evelyn was not just warm, it was heavy, fragrant, and profoundly comforting. It smelled of toasted cedar and dry hardwood smoke. Samuel Hayes stood in the doorway. He was wearing flannel pants and a long-sleeved thermal shirt, looking entirely unbothered. He didn't smile, but he didn't gloat either. He took one look at their blue lips and frost-covered eyebrows and stepped aside. "Get in! Quickly!" Samuel commanded, his voice holding an authoritative edge they had never heard before. They stumbled across the threshold and Samuel shoved the door shut, throwing a heavy iron latch. The contrast was staggering. The interior of the cabin was bathed in the soft golden glow of several oil lanterns, but the most shocking sensation was the floor. As Richard collapsed onto the hardwood peeling off his frozen gloves, he realized the wood beneath him was actively aggressively radiating heat. It felt like lying on a massive gentle heating pad. The thousands of pounds of river stones hidden in the void beneath them were doing their job, acting as a massive thermal battery, absorbing the heat from the outdoor furnace and releasing it steadily into the living space. "Boots off! Wet coats by the door," Samuel instructed, moving toward a heavy cast-iron wood stove sitting in the corner atop which a large kettle of water was beginning to whistle. "Get near the center of the room. The heat distribution is highest there." Evelyn was shivering violently, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, her teeth chattering. "Samuel, I'm so sorry. We laughed at you." "Ha! Hypothermia doesn't care about apologies." "Evelyn," Samuel said quietly, pouring hot water into 2 thick ceramic mugs and dropping in tea bags. He handed them over. "Drink this, slowly." Over the next 6 hours, they weren't the only ones to make the desperate trek. As the temperature continued to dive and the snow piled higher, the neighborhood's pride broke completely. Gregory Dunn, the county inspector who had threatened to condemn the cabin, arrived just before sunset. He had abandoned his county vehicle in a snowdrift and walked a mile, abandoning his clipboard and his authority in the frozen wasteland. 2 other families from down the street followed shortly after, dragging terrified, freezing children on plastic sleds. By nightfall, 12 people were huddled in Samuel's open-plan living room. Samuel stood before them holding an oil lantern. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the howling wind outside. "Listen to me," Samuel began, his voice echoing slightly in the timber-framed room. "You are welcome here, but this is not a hotel. It is a survival engine, and an engine requires fuel." He pointed a finger toward the floorboards. "Beneath us is the hypocaust. It requires a massive amount of high-density hardwood to maintain the thermal mass. I have enough wood split and stacked in the void below the cabin to last 2 months, but the furnace is outside. It must be stoked every 4 hours, 24 hours a day, regardless of the wind or the cold." Samuel looked directly at Richard, then at Gregory Dunn. "I built the void with a trap door from the inside, dropping down into the skirting. You will not have to go out into the blizzard, but you will have to go down into the cold zone, retrieve the wood, and feed the firebox through the internal access panel. We run a watch, 2-man shifts. If the fire dies, the stones cool. If the stones cool, the water pipes in the void freeze and we lose our drinking supply. Do you understand?" "Yes," Richard said immediately. The loud booming arrogance of the contractor entirely vanished. "Tell us what to do, Sam." The dynamic of Pine Haven shifted permanently in that moment. The outcast became the commander. The eccentrics became the engineers of salvation. For the next 3 days, the refugees of Whispering Pines lived by the rules of the void. Richard and Gregory spent their shifts dropping through the floor trap door into the insulated freezing dark of the stilt space, hauling heavy armfuls of oak to feed the roaring beast of the furnace. Evelyn, shedding her gossipy nature, took charge of rationing the dry goods Samuel had meticulously stored in his elevated pantry, melting clean snow on the wood stove to supplement their water supply. They were surviving, but they were about to witness exactly why conventional wisdom was sometimes a deadly trap. The dawn of the 5th day brought no sunlight, only a slightly lighter shade of gray to the howling whiteout. The radio broadcast before it died completely had confirmed 42 inches of snow had already fallen, with massive heavy drifts created by the relentless wind. Inside the cabin, the temperature held steady at a luxurious 68 degrees, but outside, physics was preparing to exact a brutal toll on the valley. Samuel stood by the reinforced triple-paned window, looking out toward the neighborhood. Richard came to stand beside him, holding a mug of instant coffee. "How much weight can those trusses hold?" Samuel asked quietly, pointing through the glass. Richard squinted through the driving snow. He was looking at his own home. The sprawling ranch-style house had a relatively low-pitch roof, a common aesthetic choice in modern suburban builds. Because it was heavily insulated, none of the internal heat before the power failed had escaped to melt the snow. Now nearly 4 feet of dense wind-packed snow sat dead on top of it. Richard did the contractor math in his head and his stomach plummeted. Snow that dense? It's about 20 pounds per cubic foot. The roof is roughly 2,000 square feet. 80,000 pounds, Samuel murmured. 40 tons of dead weight pushing down on standard 2x6 trusses. Suddenly, a massive shuddering thump vibrated through the floorboards of Samuel's cabin. The refugees jumped, some letting out cries of alarm. "We're fine," Samuel announced, not taking his eyes off the window. "Look," he pointed to the steep-pitched metal roof of his own cabin. The friction of the snow against the slick metal combined with the extreme angle had finally overcome the grip of the ice. A massive sheet of snow weighing thousands of pounds had just avalanched off the roof, plummeting harmlessly to the ground below. The elevated design meant the falling snow simply piled up around the stilts, never blocking the elevated windows or threatening the structure. The roof had cleared itself. "The pitch is 45 degrees, Samuel explained to Richard. "It sheds load automatically. Yours doesn't." Richard stared at his house. Even from 400 yards away, he could see the roofline beginning to sag. The heavy aesthetic eaves he'd been so proud of were bowing under the immense pressure. "It's going to fail," Richard whispered, the reality of his total financial ruin crashing down on him. It didn't happen like in the movies. There was no fiery explosion. It was a slow, agonizing, mechanical death. First came the sound, a deep, resonant groaning that managed to pierce the roar of the wind. It was the sound of hundreds of heavy steel nails being slowly pried out of their wooden joists. Then, a sharp, echoing crack like a cannon firing in the valley. Before Richard's horrified eyes, the center peak of his sprawling ranch home simply gave up. The massive weight of the snow snapped the main load-bearing ridge beam. The roof inverted, collapsing inward in a massive cloud of powdered snow and splintered lumber. The exterior walls, pushed outward by the collapsing trusses, blew out into the yard. In a matter of 3 seconds, a $500,000 modern home was reduced to a shattered, buried crater of debris. A collective gasp echoed through Samuel's cabin. Evelyn covered her mouth, stifling a scream. Gregory Dunn stared in absolute shock, his mind racing through the building codes he had enforced for 20 years, realizing none of them accounted for this level of extreme compounding failure. Had Richard and his family stayed in that house, huddled in the living room trying to stay warm, they would have been crushed instantly under 40 tons of snow and timber. Richard placed a trembling hand on the thick window pane. He had spent his entire life building heavy, grounded, immovable things. He had mocked the man who built his house on chicken legs hovering above the dirt. Now, looking at the destroyed ruins of his own arrogance, he finally understood. In the face of nature's absolute fury, you didn't fight the earth by digging into it. You survived by rising above it, letting the elements pass beneath you, and relying on the ancient, undeniable laws of physics. Samuel stepped back from the window, his expression solemn. He didn't offer pity. He simply walked over to the heavy iron grate covering the trap door. "The fire is burning low," Samuel said to the quiet, stunned room. "Dunn Brooks, it's your shift. Get to the void." Richard didn't argue. He didn't feel like a wealthy contractor anymore. He felt like a survivor, profoundly grateful to be walking toward a dark, freezing crawlspace to haul wood for the man he had once called a fool. Time inside the elevated cabin blurred into a continuous, exhausting loop. For 8 days, the sun did not exist. There was only the screaming white void outside the triple-paned windows and the relentless rhythmic demand of the hippocaust beneath their feet. The 12 souls trapped within Samuel Hayes's sanctuary developed a synchronized, almost military routine. They slept in shifts huddled together in the warm center of the open floor plan, their bodies soaking in the radiant heat of the river stones. But the psychological toll of the century storm was beginning to manifest. The destruction of Richard Brooks's house had served as a grim reminder of their fragile existence. Every groan of the wind against the cabin's cedar siding made Evelyn Carmichael flinch. Gregory Dunn, the once proud county inspector, had developed a nervous tic, constantly checking the sealed seams of the windows, waiting for the structural failure that his training told him was inevitable. Yet the elevated cabin held firm. The aerodynamic flow of the wind beneath the structure prevented the catastrophic pressure buildup that was systematically dismantling the rest of the Whispering Pines subdivision. On the morning of the 9th day, however, the sanctuary faced its deadliest internal threat. It began subtly. Richard, exhausted from a grueling night shift in the void, was asleep near the cast-iron wood stove. He woke up shivering. He rubbed his eyes, disoriented, and placed a hand flat against the hardwood floor. The luxurious radiating warmth was fading. The floor was merely tepid. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in his chest. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the stiffness in his joints, and rushed to the heavy iron grate that covered the trapdoor to the stilt space. Gregory was down there midway through his shift. Richard wrenched the grate open. Done. What's happening? The floor is cooling. Gregory's face appeared in the dim light of the void below, smeared with soot and sweat. He looked terrified. I'm feeding it, Richard. I've been throwing oak in for an hour, but the fire's dying. It's choking out. The smoke is backing up into the firebox. Samuel, who had been resting in the loft, descended the wooden stairs with quiet urgency. He didn't ask questions. He bypassed Richard, dropped through the trap door, and landed silently in the insulated subspace. The air down here was usually crisp and clear, warmed slightly by the radiant heat escaping the stones above. Now, a faint, acrid haze of wood smoke was beginning to pool near the ceiling of the void. Samuel moved quickly to the internal access panel of the external furnace. He unlatched the heavy iron door. Inside the massive firebox, a pile of premium seasoned hardwood was merely smoldering, producing thick gray smoke, but no heat-generating flames. The heart of the survival engine was going into cardiac arrest. The thermal draft is broken, Samuel stated, his voice tight. He quickly slammed the iron door shut to prevent more smoke from entering the void. The hypocaust relies on a continuous flow of oxygen to create a high-temperature burn, which creates the vacuum that pulls the heat through the clay pipes. If the fire starves, the vacuum fails. The stones will cool completely within 6 hours. Are we out of wood? Gregory asked, his voice trembling. No, Samuel replied, shining a heavy-duty flashlight toward the thick wooden skirting that separated them from the storm. The fuel is fine. The engine can't breathe. The primary air intake pipe for the combustion chamber is located on the exterior of the brick furnace facing north. The wind must have shifted. A drift has packed solid ice and snow into the intake valve. Richard dropped down into the void beside them. So we clear it from the inside. Samuel shook his head grimly. We can't. The intake is a 6-inch steel pipe encased in the exterior masonry. The only way to clear it is from the outside. A heavy silence fell over the three men, broken only by the distant muffled roar of the blizzard. Going outside was a death sentence. The temperature had stabilized at 30 degrees below zero, but the wind chill pushed it closer to -60. Visibility was zero. To leave the insulated safety of the cabin was to step onto an alien hostile planet. "Ida, if we don't clear it," Samuel said, his tone entirely pragmatic, devoid of panic, but heavy with truth. "The water pipes in this void will freeze and burst by midnight. We will lose our drinking water. By tomorrow morning, the internal temperature of the cabin will drop below freezing. With 12 people, we might survive 2 days of internal freezing temperatures before hypothermia takes the weakest among us. Evelyn won't survive the first night." Gregory swallowed hard, his eyes wide behind his smudged glasses. I can't. I have a bad heart, Samuel. The cold, the shock, it'll kill me before I even reach the furnace." Richard looked at his hands, calloused strong, the hands of a man who had built massive failing structures. He thought of his house crushed to splinters under the weight of his own hubris. He thought of Samuel, the man he had mocked, who had opened his doors without a single word of reproach. "I'll do it," Richard said, his voice surprisingly steady. Samuel looked at him intently, assessing the contractor's physical condition. Richard was exhausted, running on a calorie deficit, but he possessed a deep, stubborn strength. "It's 20 feet from the porch stairs to the back of the furnace," Samuel said slowly. "In this wind, 20 feet might as well be a mile. You will be completely blind. The snow is packed so tightly you won't be able to walk. You'll have to dig and crawl. If you lose your bearings, you will freeze to death 10 feet from the door." "I'm a contractor, Sam." Richard managed a faint, ironic smile. "I'm good at digging." The preparation was a frantic, silent affair. Upstairs in the main living space, the other refugees watched with bated breath as Richard layered every piece of thermal clothing they could spare. He wore 3 pairs of wool socks, 2 pairs of thermal leggings, Samuel's heaviest insulated canvas overalls, and a thick, down-filled expedition parka. His face was covered by a neoprene ski mask topped with a wool balaclava, and finally thick ski goggles to protect his eyes from the ice shrapnel. Samuel produced a heavy braided nylon climbing rope. He secured a massive steel carabiner to one end and wrapped the other end securely around Richard's waist, tying a complex load-bearing knot. "I've anchored the line to the primary steel I-beam beneath the floorboards," Samuel explained, checking the knot with a sharp tug. "It gives you exactly 30 feet of slack. Keep the line taut. When you reach the furnace, you'll find the intake pipe near the base on the left side. It has a steel mesh cover. You have to break the ice block completely free. Do not take off your gloves no matter how hard it is to grip the tools." Samuel handed Richard a heavy, short-handled steel masonry hammer and a long, thick steel awl. "2 heavy tugs on the rope means pull me in," Richard said, his voice muffled behind the layers of neoprene and wool. Samuel locked eyes with him. "Don't be a hero, Richard. If your extremities go numb, you pull that rope. A cold house is better than a dead man." They moved to the heavy oak front door. The sound of the wind on the other side was deafening, a high-pitched shriek that sounded like tearing metal. Samuel grabbed the iron latch. He looked at Richard one last time, nodded, and threw the door open. The cabin instantly violently depressurized. A blinding wave of white powder exploded into the foyer, knocking Evelyn off her feet and plunging the room into a swirling fog. The cold was an immediate physical blow. It felt like being submerged in liquid nitrogen. Richard stepped out onto the porch, and Samuel slammed the door shut behind him, plunging the contractor into an isolated, roaring hell. The moment Richard stepped off the protected porch and into the open, the wind caught him. It was a solid, moving wall of kinetic energy. It slammed into his chest, throwing him backward into the porch railing. He gasped, but the air was so cold it seized his lungs, making him choke. He dropped to his hands and knees. Standing was impossible. The snow was not soft powder. The extreme wind had packed it into massive concrete-like drifts. He had to use the heavy steel awl to stab into the drift, pulling his body weight forward, like an ice climber scaling a horizontal glacier. Visibility was absolutely zero. The ski goggles were useless, instantly icing over from his own shallow, terrified breath. He was blind, deafened by the roar, and moving entirely by the tension of the rope trailing behind him. 20 feet. It was nothing. A casual stroll across a driveway. Here it was an endless, torturous expedition. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The cold was bypassing the heavy parka, slicing through the canvas overalls and sinking its teeth into his bones. His fingers, wrapped tightly around the steel tools, were already screaming in agony. Suddenly, his helmeted head slammed hard into solid, unyielding brick. He had found the furnace. Richard blindly felt his way along the freezing masonry. He dragged himself around to the north-facing side. The wind here was creating a terrifying vortex, pinning him against the brickwork. He fumbled near the base, his thick gloves clumsily searching for the 6-inch steel pipe. He found nothing but a smooth, solid wall of ice. A massive drift had compacted directly against the brick, burying the intake under 3 feet of frozen, densely packed snow. Richard raised the masonry hammer and brought it down hard. The impact vibrated up his arm, jarring his shoulder, but the ice barely chipped. It was like striking solid quartz. Panic threatened to overwhelm him. He couldn't breathe properly. His toes were entirely numb, heavy blocks of dead wood inside his boots. He swung again and again, using the steel awl as a chisel and driving it inward with the hammer. Crack, shatter. Chunks of ice the size of dinner plates began to break free. He dug frantically, acting on primal survival instinct. He threw aside massive blocks of frozen snow, digging a narrow tunnel toward the brick. Finally, the tip of his awl scraped against steel mesh. He had found it. The mesh was completely encased in a thick, translucent plug of solid ice. Richard jammed the awl directly into the center of the ice plug and struck the back of it with the hammer with every ounce of his fading strength. The ice shattered. Instantly, a massive audible hiss cut through the storm. The vacuum of the hippocaust, starved of oxygen for hours, violently inhaled. It sucked air through the cleared pipe with the force of a jet engine. From deep within the furnace, Richard heard a muffled explosive whump as the dying embers were hit with a massive rush of pure oxygen. The firebox instantly reignited a roaring inferno, coming back to life. Within seconds, the brick wall he was leaning against began to radiate a faint life-saving heat. He had done it. But as Richard tried to push himself backward away from the furnace to begin the crawl back, his body betrayed him. The adrenaline crash was instantaneous. His exhausted, freezing muscles simply stopped firing. His arms felt like lead. He tried to grip the rope to give the 2 required tugs, but his fingers were frozen into permanent hooks. He couldn't close his hand. He slumped sideways into the snowbank, staring blindly into the whiteout. The cold suddenly stopped hurting. A terrifying, warm lethargy began to wash over him. It felt so comfortable to simply close his eyes. He let the steel hammer slip from his useless grip. Inside the cabin, Samuel stood by the front door, his hand gripping the nylon rope. He felt the tension slacken completely. There were no tugs. The rope simply went dead. "He's down!" Samuel shouted, his voice cracking like a whip over the terrified murmurs of the refugees. Samuel didn't bother putting on a parka. There was no time. He grabbed a heavy wooden snow shovel, threw open the front door, and charged out into the blizzard in his flannel shirt and overalls. He followed the bright yellow rope, diving directly into the waist-deep trench Richard had painstakingly carved. The cold hit Samuel like a physical assault, instantly turning the sweat on his face into sharp crystals. He scrambled forward like a madman, his lungs burning. He found Richard slumped against the brickwork, covered in a fresh layer of snow, his eyes closed. Samuel grabbed Richard by the collar of his parka, hauling him upward with a desperate, adrenaline-fueled heave. He didn't try to make Richard walk. He grabbed the carabiner attached to Richard's waist, locked his arms under Richard's armpits, and began to drag him backward through the trench. It was a feat of sheer brute force. Samuel's muscles tore his boots, slipping on the hard-packed ice. The wind fought him for every inch, trying to claim its prize. But Samuel possessed the furious strength of a man who refused to let his sanctuary become a tomb. He reached the porch stairs, dragging the 250-pound contractor up the wooden steps. Evelyn and Gregory had the door open, braving the incoming snow. Samuel hauled Richard over the threshold, collapsing onto the warm hardwood floor alongside him. Gregory slammed the heavy door shut, throwing the deadbolt. The cabin was silent, save for the ragged, gasping breaths of the 2 men on the floor. Samuel rolled over onto his back, staring at the timber-framed ceiling, his flannel shirt soaked in freezing snow. Beneath him, the floorboards were already beginning to grow noticeably warmer. The massive thermal battery was recharging. Evelyn rushed forward with heavy wool blankets, wrapping them tightly around Richard, who was barely conscious, shivering violently as the life-saving pain of thawing blood returned to his extremities. "The fire!" Richard slurred, his teeth chattering loud enough to echo in the quiet room. "Is it burning?" Samuel slowly sat up, rubbing his freezing hands over his face. He looked at the contractor who had once mocked his every move. "It's burning, Richard," Samuel said softly, a profound respect settling into his eyes. "You saved the engine. You saved all of us." The century storm did not end with a dramatic finale. It surrendered with a slow, agonizing gasp. After 14 relentless days of screaming wind and blinding whiteouts, the cataclysmic atmospheric pressure finally began to fracture. The howling gale that had relentlessly battered the Pine Haven Valley reduced to a low, mournful moan, then a tired whisper. and finally it faded into an absolute eerie silence. On the morning of the 15th day since the initial freeze, the thick bruised clouds overhead broke apart. Brilliant blinding sunlight poured into the valley, reflecting off the pristine frozen landscape with the intensity of 1,000 mirrors. Inside the elevated cabin, the transition was profound. Evelyn Carmichael was the first to wake. She lay on her makeshift pallet near the cast-iron wood stove, staring blankly at the triple-paned windows. For 2 weeks, those windows had displayed nothing but a terrifying, churning void of gray and white. Now, a sharp golden beam of sunlight cut across the living room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the warm air. She didn't speak. She simply pulled her knees to her chest and began to weep, not from fear, but from the overwhelming, crushing relief of survival. Slowly, the other 11 occupants stirred. They gathered around the massive reinforced glass panes, shielding their eyes against the glare. The thermometer mounted on the cedar wall read a luxurious, impossible 71 degrees. The floor beneath their stockinged feet still pulsed with the steady, radiant heat of the hypocaust engine, the river stones continuing their silent, life-saving work. But the view outside the glass stole the breath from their lungs. Whispering Pines. The proud, wealthy subdivision that had once defined suburban mountain living was completely unrecognizable. It was no longer a neighborhood. It was a monolithic alien landscape. The topography had been entirely erased by an ocean of snow. Massive undulating drifts, some cresting 30 feet high, had swallowed property lines, mailboxes, roads, and vehicles entirely. The familiar landmarks of their lives were gone, buried under millions of tons of frozen precipitation. The devastation visited upon the structures themselves was horrifying. Richard Brooks pressed his hands against the glass, his eyes scanning the horizon for the familiar roofline of his sprawling $500,000 ranch. There was nothing. Where his home had once stood, there was only a smooth, massive mound of white. The immense weight of the snow had completely crushed the structure, burying the splintered remains so deeply that not a single piece of lumber broke the surface of the drift. Had he and his family remained in that house, trusting the heavy concrete slab and the modern insulation, they would have been entombed beneath 40 tons of crushed drywall and freezing timber. Further down the road, Evelyn's home offered a similarly grim portrait of architectural failure. It was still partially standing, but the roof had buckled violently inward, forming a deep V shape where the central load-bearing spine had snapped like dry kindling. The walls were bowed outward, the windows shattered by the immense pressure of the shifting ice. Down the entire street, chimney stacks lay broken, and massive, thick sheets of ice encased the ruined husks of the heavily insulated, ground-level fortresses. Of the 20 primary residences in the immediate vicinity, only one stood entirely pristine, structurally sound, and utterly unharmed. Samuel Hayes' elevated cabin looked like a magnificent wooden ship floating triumphantly upon a frozen white sea. The aerodynamic genius of the design was now undeniable. While the massive drifts had piled up everywhere else, the wind whipping under the stilt foundation had carved a perfect clear moat around the base of the home. The heavy wooden skirting remained intact, the 4-foot void entirely free of the crushing pressure that had destroyed the neighboring foundations. High above, the steep-pitched metal roof gleamed in the sunlight, completely clear of snow, having automatically shed its dangerous burden days ago. The profound silence of the valley was eventually broken by a deep rhythmic thumping that reverberated in their chests before they could even hear it. A massive twin-rotor National Guard Chinook helicopter crested the eastern ridgeline, its dark green hull a stark, beautiful contrast against the blinding sky. The Guard had been running triage missions since dawn. Their grim expectation for the Whispering Pines sector was entirely body recovery. Aerial thermal imaging had shown nothing but dead freezing zones across the buried subdivision. Because Samuel's cabin was the only structure standing intact, and because it possessed a clear, flat roofline free of deadly debris, the massive helicopter altered its flight path, hovering low over the property and kicking up a localized blizzard of loose powder. A side door slid open, and heavily geared rescue personnel dropped rappelling ropes, preparing to breach the cabin to search for casualties. They were entirely unprepared for what happened next. Samuel Hayes calmly walked to the heavy oak front door, disengaged the iron deadbolt, and pushed it open. 12 people walked out onto the elevated snow-free porch. They were not suffering from frostbite. They were not wrapped in emergency mylar blankets. They stepped out into the freezing morning air, wearing flannel shirts, cotton sweatpants, and light sweaters waving up at the roaring aircraft. A tactical medic named Captain Miller descended the rope landing on the porch with a heavy thud. He looked at the group, his eyes wide behind his tactical goggles, then pushed past them into the cabin. The blast of 70-degree wood smoke-scented air hit him like a physical wall. "How?" Captain Miller breathed, pulling down his face mask and staring at the warm hardwood floor, then at the single quiet man standing by the wood stove. "We've pulled 60 bodies out of basements across the county this morning. The grid has been dead for 2 weeks. How are you people alive?" Gregory Dunn, the county inspector who had once threatened to condemn the very building that saved his life, stepped forward. He looked at the military medic, then pointed a trembling finger down at the floorboards. "Ancient Rome, Captain. He built an engine under the floor, and we kept it fed." The evacuation was a swift, highly coordinated military operation. The survivors were hoisted up into the hovering Chinook one by one, leaving the sanctuary behind. When it was Richard Brooks's turn to step into the extraction harness, he paused. The burly contractor turned back to look at Samuel Hayes. Samuel was meticulously securing the iron latch on the cast-iron wood stove, ensuring the embers were safely contained before abandoning the structure. Richard walked back across the warm floor. The arrogance, the loud bravado, the mockery that had defined his relationship with Samuel, all of it, had been stripped away, crushed under the weight of the collapsed roof across the street. He was a man humbled by nature and saved by the grace of the man he had ridiculed, Samuel. "Richard," said his voice thick with unwept tears and profound exhaustion. He reached out, grasping the older man's hand in a fierce, desperate grip. "I owe you my life. We all do. When the thaw comes, when the insurance clears and we dig out of this hell, I have to rebuild. And I won't do it unless you design it. I don't just want to hire you. I want you to teach me." Samuel looked at the ruined contractor. A gentle, genuine smile crinkled the corners of his eyes, devoid of any vindication or, "I told you so." "We'll put it on stilts, Richard," Samuel promised, quietly returning the firm handshake. "We let the earth heave, we let the water freeze, and we let the wind pass beneath us. We stop fighting the mountain, and we let it breathe." Richard let out a breath that sounded like a ragged laugh. 6 feet high, Sam, minimum. I want a fortress in the sky." 6 months later, the Pinehaven Valley was a landscape reborn in the wake of unimaginable tragedy. The spring thaw had been brutal, revealing the absolute splintered destruction of the conventional homes. The insurance payouts were massive, flooding the county with capital, but the psychological shift in the valley was far more valuable than the money. The conventional wisdom that had dictated heavy ground-level slabs in deeply buried basements was completely, permanently abandoned. If you drive through the Whispering Pines subdivision today, you will not see low-slung ranch homes hunkered down against the dirt, stubbornly trying to anchor themselves to a volatile earth. You will see a neighborhood suspended in the air. You will see beautiful modern timber-framed cabins built on thick, deeply anchored steel pillars. You will see heavy, aesthetically pleasing insulated skirting, hiding massive, carefully engineered thermal voids filled with dense riverstones and clay piping. You will see steep-pitched metal roofs designed to effortlessly shrug off the heaviest snowfalls before the weight can ever become a threat. At the very center of this architectural revolution stands Samuel Hayes's original cabin. It is no longer viewed as an eyesore, a UFO landing pad, or a source of neighborhood mockery. It stands as the structural blueprint for an entire community's survival. The quiet, unassuming man they had all called a fool had engineered their salvation, fundamentally changing the way humanity interacted with the hostile environment. He proved unequivocally that true survival isn't about fighting the terrifying forces of nature with sheer immovable mass. It is about understanding those forces, adapting to their rhythm, and having the wisdom to let the deadly storm pass right beneath your feet. The terrifying reality of the century storm proved that arrogance is the ultimate structural flaw. Samuel Hayes didn't just build a cabin. He built a masterpiece of ancient engineering that laughed in the face of modern failing architecture. The very people who pointed fingers and mocked his design were forced to literally crawl to his doorstep, begging for the warmth of the brilliant Hipparcos system hidden in the void. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the crazy outcast is the only one prepared for the apocalypse. If this intense journey of survival, structural collapse, and ultimate redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves off-grid engineering survival stories or just a deeply satisfying tale of karma. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss out on our incredible true-to-life storytelling. Stay warm, stay prepared, and we'll see you in the next video.